So appreciate everyone who's joined into the session today. I know it's kind of been a little bit of a unique event. Several of you were probably hoping to be able to attend this in person, and I know I was really looking forward to that. Fortunately, other plans happened and we weren't able to do that. So, but happy to be with you guys here virtually to talk to you about determining the cost to move to Azure. So wanted to welcome all of you guys. If you do have any questions, just drop them in the chat there and I'll try to address those as we go through the presentation. A little bit about myself. I am currently the Director of Data Management for LifePoint Health, which is a large healthcare company based out of Nashville. I've listed on here for you all my different contact information on there. Feel free to hit me up on Twitter or shoot me an email if you have any questions after this presentation. I do have some things on my blog out there. I haven't done as well about blogging as what I was hoping to be able to do, so I do consider myself a struggling blogger. But I do have some articles that are written out there. And I do speak at a lot of events pretty much all over the world about different topics. So do get an opportunity to do that quite often. And then I help co-lead the Nashville SQL User Group and SQL Saturday. Within there. If you're not familiar, for example, with SQL Saturdays, those are free training events that do happen. I know if you guys are located in Louisville does have one of those. I actually spoke at it last year, which is a great event. So check that out. SQL Saturdays, again, free training events. Some other notes, just quick notes about me, as I am on the Product Advisory Council at SentryOne. You will notice within this particular presentation, I'm presenting on a SentryOne deck. The reason I'm doing that is this presentation, the content within here, is part of a larger presentation that I partnered together with on SentryOne that we were doing at Microsoft Centers earlier this year. So it's a subset of that, one of the core components that I worked on in terms of the presentation, the larger presentation, but it was in kind of a partnership with SentryOne. So not going to market those guys or tell you a lot. I will just say, they're a great product. If you're looking at SQL monitoring tools or some other tools, they have a great selection of tools. Would encourage you to definitely check those out. So a little bit about me, enough about me. You're probably more interested in actually hearing some of the content. So we'll jump into that. One other thing I guess I'll note, these events are made possible by the amazing sponsors. If it wasn't for the money that these guys give, they wouldn't be able to do these types of events at this low of a cost. So huge thanks to them. Check out those guys, go talk to them because they're what makes these type of events possible. All right, so if you are joining in here, what are we going to talk about? So there's a handful of things we're going to go through today. First thing is, you may be thinking cost management at a developer conference. What in the world is going on? And why should I care about that? So we're going to address that head on in the beginning of why that should be important to you. We're going to get started with discuss how to get started with building a budget for a migration to the cloud. So if you're thinking about the cloud, what do I need to do to figure out how much it's going to cost? That's probably an important question that your business is asking you. And then I'm going to share with you some tips and tricks along the way to reduce cost and how to get some better estimates and be able to do that. All right, so let's talk about why managing cost is so important. So cost is one of the leading factors that keep people from moving to the cloud or influence their decision to move out. So we don't really hear a lot about companies, moving out of the cloud, but we hear a lot of stories about it with moving in because it's a lot better marketing story from these cloud providers. But actually, there's several companies who have made the decision to actually migrate away from it because they've gotten there, and for whatever reason, they found out that the cost didn't quite amount up to what they thought it was going to be. You may hear the term cloud repatriation. If you Google that, you'll find all kinds of stories where people have gone through and actually moved out of it because the cost was just too high. A quick story that I went through and kind of led me down this road to kind of really getting in and diving into the cost side was there was a company that I worked at a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, where we were heavily looking at the cloud, migrating some of our data workloads to the cloud. It made sense in so many different situations. Like everything we looked at was like, oh, cloud's perfect for this, cloud's perfect for this. But we ended up not going forward with the move because we couldn't explain to leadership what it was going to cost. And the consultants that we brought in, Microsoft that we brought in, they also couldn't explain what it was going to cost to get there. So we ended up not making the move. And it wasn't because the cost was so expensive as one might think. It was simply because we didn't know how to figure it out or what to do to be able to get those answers. So what we're going to go through today is not necessarily, give you the answer to be able to do that. There's no easy button here, but show you how you can get those answers in the process to go through to be able to get those answers so that you can get that. One other thing I'll note from here, we're obviously living in interesting times now with the pandemic going on and all of everything that has impacted. So companies right now, cost is becoming even more important than maybe it was, 6 months ago. I have several friends who work for companies. I have colleagues who have either been laid off or had to take pay reductions for periods of time because of the results of things that have been going on. And companies, including mine and several others that I know, are looking for ways to be able to cut cost so they don't have to have any impact on their staff. With any organization, just about IT is going to be one of the highest costs that they have. So in terms of cost savings, it's an area that you can realize probably more cost savings than you can others. So being able to manage those costs, understand those costs, finds ways to reduce those costs is really, really important for companies at this point. And it's very important, or it's very valuable if you're a resource that can find those sorts of savings to be able to present those to your organization. So that's a quick look at why managing costs is important for most companies, but why is cost management maybe important to you? If you're a developer who's attending this session or you're an IT professional of some other flavor, why does this really impact you when we think about the cloud? So if I could sum this up, it would be that every architectural decision that we make in the cloud has a cost to it. So if you're a resource within your company, despite whatever your role may be, and you have the ability to be able to go into the cloud, or will have the ability to go into the cloud and scale or tier or create services or do things within there, every decision that you make, every time you click the button to spin something up, or every time you click the button to scale something, there's a cost that's tied to that. And being able to understand what that cost that ties to it is going to be very important to your organization to be able to do that. In addition to when you're building out your architecture for what you're going to be doing in the cloud, there's a lot of different ways you can skin a cat in terms of building these. There's a lot of different architectures that you can go through. With different types of services. There's not necessarily, if I'm moving this particular workload to the cloud, I have one option. No, I have a whole myriad of options that I can do. Being able to compare those architectures to actual cost can help factor into some of that decision making. So if your company's maybe looking for a cheaper option, maybe being able to evaluate those and communicate the cost back to your organization is going to be really, really important. All right, so benefits of the cloud. I'm not going to go through a lot of these. You've probably been hearing about the cloud for years at this point. You've probably attended some other sessions about it, or even seen some sessions of this event that tells you, why the cloud is so important. There's so many different benefits of moving to the cloud. I've listed a handful here. Again, there's probably more. Despite whichever one you're going through, whether it's Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, a lot of them offer the same benefits. So we often hear about these sorts of benefits that get there, but where does cost play into this? So there's a saying that I've heard many times as we've worked with consultants or we've worked with Microsoft or various folks kind of throughout the years, is that moving to the cloud saves me money. Like we just think, oh, if I can move my infrastructure there, we're going to get immediate cost savings and it's going to save me money. But does it? My experience has been in most cases that moving to the cloud does not necessarily save you money. As the cloud's becoming more and more used and it's becoming more widely accepted, hardware vendors are starting to reduce the cost of their hardware or offer more competitive pricing. So it's driven the cost of some of the on-prem costs that were maybe higher 5 or 6 years ago has actually been driven down to be more comparable. Additionally, there's a lot of, I won't necessarily say hidden cost when you move to the cloud, but there's a lot of things you just don't think to consider when you're migrating there. You look at it from, oh, I have a VM or a physical server on-prem. If I move that to the cloud, here's what it's going to cost me. Now, that's cheaper, but there's a lot of other things that aren't necessarily factored into that. If you're thinking of moving to the cloud to save money, I don't think it's really a great reason to really consider it, because there's a good chance you could end up spending more. There's also a chance you could save money, depending on how you're architecting your solutions and thinking about it. But I never think of that as a reason to actually make the move. There's a lot of other considerations that go into it. Again, as I mentioned kind of earlier on, there are a lot of companies. Again, if you Google cloud repatriation and you go and look at that, you can read stories of companies who have done migrations to it and found out it cost a whole lot more money than what they originally were thinking. All right, so again, there is no easy button to be able to figure this out. The tools and the information are out there. They're available for you to be able to use to estimate your cost to Azure. It'll help you determine what your run rate is, but it does require some planning and work. So you're not going to be able to go on and run this script in your environment, go through, import it into a tool, and it's going to tell you exactly everything you need to know about your migration and what it's going to cost. There's a little bit of work that's going to have to go into this to be able to answer these questions. So first, let's talk about how to get started. So if you're new to cloud services, or your company is just starting to look at this, and maybe you haven't had the privilege of working for an organization that has utilized cloud technologies, and you are starting from ground zero of maybe you've attended some sessions, watched some videos, read some articles online, but you're really just now getting started within Azure. So how do you get started? Like, what do I do to, getting started, not just with managing the cost, but just with getting started with in general, which goes along with it. First thing is getting familiar with it. If you haven't worked with cloud, or you're not that familiar with it, start utilizing some free credits that may exist out there, or set aside a small budget as an organization to just allow you time to get familiar with it. I could tell you 1,000 things about Azure. You could read 1,000 blogs, but really, in my perspective, it doesn't really start to make sense until you actually get in there and start doing it, start spinning things up and see what the impacts are, etc. In terms of free credits, if your organization doesn't have a small budget set aside, or they don't have any programs that offer you free credits, a couple that you can use, Dev Essentials, which is free to sign up for, gives you, I want to say, $150 credit to be able to go into Azure and start doing things, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're working in small tiers, it can go a long way. Another thing, and something that I use for just personal testing and such things, is if you're a Visual Studio subscriber, you get free credits with that as well. So I'm an Enterprise Visual Studio Enterprise subscriber, which gives me $150 per month. So I'll utilize a lot of those credits to go in, play with new services. I'll spin things up, like some of the costing when we get into the Azure Calculator. Can be a little difficult to understand, because it feels like you're getting nickel and dime on a lot of things. But just getting into Azure and spinning something up and giving it time to generate some of those costs, and then going to look at it to see, okay, I did X, Y, and Z, how does this translate to a cost, can really give you a strong understanding of what that is. Consider working with a reputable third party or with a service provider. Getting started within Azure, one of the most difficult things that I have found with getting started really with any cloud solution is just getting the framework right. So working through the network connectivity, working through your organizational and resource governance within there, just getting the framework laid so that it's secure and it's something that you can grow on is a lot of times, I think, one of the most difficult steps. If you have familiarity with it, or if you have resources, it may not be something that you need. You may not need to work with a reputable third party, but if you're starting from ground zero, scratch, it's something I'd absolutely consider. not a requirement, but just something to think about. This is a big one. If you're just thinking about going to the cloud, the best piece of advice that I can give you is start slow and with light workloads. Rome wasn't built in a day. You don't necessarily need to go through and move your entire data center into the cloud all at once, because that's an appetite for disaster, especially if it's not something you're comfortable with or have done before. And a lot of the companies that have moved out because they tried to do it all in one fell swoop, because some company shows up and says, oh yeah, we can move you to Azure and we can have you there in 3 months. But the best piece of advice that I can give you on getting started with this, especially in terms of managing cost, is start slow and with light workloads. You need to get some familiarity with what you're building in there and its impacts to the cost before you go and move the entire farm. It gives you an opportunity to get an idea of performance, gives you an opportunity to get an idea from cost, and so much more to get comfortable with it on it. So start slow and with light workloads if that's something that you're considering. Learn the tools available. So we're going to go through several tools here in a moment that help you kind of factor those costs, but get familiar with those tools and know what those are and get comfortable using them. And then, as we mentioned when we were talking about the reputable third party, work with your providers as a partner. So they want you to succeed. If you're moving to Azure, which is what we're talking about in this presentation, work with Microsoft on it. Reach out to Microsoft and say, hey, we're looking at moving to your platform. Is there some assistance that you can help us through this as we transition into cloud? And they're more than willing to do that. Of course, they want you on their platform. They want you to succeed. All right, so going through on the tools. So the first tool that I'm going to mention to you, this is a tool that allows you to estimate the cost savings you can realize by migrating your workloads to the cloud. So when you're moving from a data center environment, or you're moving applications over or services within there, there's a lot of other things that go into comparing those costs outside of just what it costs for that particular server, especially when you're evaluating it from on-prem. So in an on-prem solution, you've got data center costs such as electricity, HVAC, you've got resource cost, you've got storage costs for storage that's getting utilized there. You've got a whole bunch of costs that make up that total on there. What this calculator allows you to do is it allows you to be able to build out the cost from what it takes for you to run something on-prem versus what it's going to run within the cloud. So the cloud is, for the most part, an all-encompassing cost that you're going to be paying. You're not going to be paying for electricity, HVAC. It's kind of all baked into a single cost, whereas with on-prem you are. So I'm going to show you this tool of what it looks like, but I'm not going to walk through all the different components with it. It is a fairly complex to go through and to collect all the information that you need to be able to do this. But if it's important to your organization to build ROI in terms of what you're moving, it can be a really, really useful tool to be able to build and show some charts to your leadership of why you think the cloud can save you money. So as I mentioned before, you can save money with the cloud. It takes a little bit of work and some understanding to be able to do that. So let me hop over here to the total cost of ownership calculator. So when you come into this calculator, you can define your workloads. So in this particular one, I just have some VMs that are added within here, some database servers and some storage that I threw some measures in there on there. I can go through here, I can add in what I'm considering moving that I wanted to do an evaluation on. If I go over here to assumptions, I have different options in here that I can add different things. So if I'm going to use Azure Hybrid Benefit, which allows me to take my licenses to the cloud, what type of storage do I want? And then on down here is where I can get into, like, you'll see things like electricity cost. So I can put a number within there. I can go into my storage costs. I can put numbers in for my IT labor cost. And then down here, I've got all these other things: data center costs, virtualization costs, electricity costs, software costs that make up all of this. And if I spend the time to go through and collect all this information, to be able to go through and put it in, I can get a fairly good assessment. I can fill that out, run this evaluation, and then go down here to view this report, and it will spit out to me some pretty nice looking reports that I can share with my leadership team that shows, how Azure can save me money within this. I can export this out. I can share it with my leadership team, again, if I'm looking to build an ROI. But it is an opportunity of something to look at if your company is really dead set on understanding of what the breakdown is. It's a tool that allows you to do this. If you are using AWS as well, they have a similar tool, a total cost of ownership calculator as well. And I believe Google Cloud does as well. So if you're looking at other solutions, they do have tools that allow you to do that as well. The Azure Calculator. So the Azure Calculator is one of the primary tools that you're going to be using when you're going through and trying to determine what your cost is. This is a tool that allows you to input different products and be able to configure those based on how you expect those to be running within the cloud. So let's jump over and look at this quite a bit here. So first, before I dive into the calculator, one other thing that I'll mention, there is on the Microsoft page, there is detailed pricing information that is available for these. If you go to this page for Azure Pricing, which is up there at the screen, you can come down here and search products and look at individual products and see specific details on it. So when we go to the calculator, some of the information may not necessarily have the level of detail to understand what it is. Or understand, what it's really asking for in there. Using this Azure pricing page is a good way to be able to just get more information on it, get a better understanding. Again, when you look at some of these items, you're going to see it's going to feel like they're nickeling and diming you on a lot of different components. And you're going to look at it and say, I'm not really sure what this means. This is a good place to go through and just get a little more detailed information. Also spells out the pricing if that's something that you're interested in. All right, let's hop over to the pricing calculator. So if you go to the pricing calculator, you'll end up on a screen that looks a little bit like this. You'll see different items up here, again, kind of along the lines of that pricing page that we were just looking at. You've got various ones here. The difference here is you can actually add these into an estimate. So you'll see I have saved estimates up here. If I were to click one of these, you'll see that it shows up that it was added. So it adds it into an estimate that I already have. If you didn't have one, it would, as soon as you click one of those items, it's going to add it to an estimate. If I scroll on down, you can see where I have this estimate already built on here. And I've already got some things where I've went through here and just created some various different items on here to build this out. So I will preface what I'm about to show you in here. Like, I'm going to focus more on the data side of things just because it's a lot of what my background is. But if you're an app developer or some other type of developer who's working within Azure, the same principles apply in how you build things. So you can add web apps, or if you're a Cosmos developer, you can add Cosmos, or if you're an analytics developer, you can do things around analytics services within here as well. It kind of follows the same pattern that you may be working with. But just for reference here, I'm primarily going to be looking at things within the data realm because that's what I work in. If I open one of these up, for example, I've got a few VMs, Azure VMs that are built within here. You can see that there's a lot of different values in here that I can go in and specify. So I have a region that exists within there, so I can select which region that my service is going to live in. One note on region, when you change the region, it can change the pricing. You may be looking at regions based on your location, so which region is closest to me. And that's generally okay. There are some ways to be able to do latency tests between different regions if that's something you're interested in. Azure Speed Test is one that does just come off the top of my head, where you can check latency between regions. So if you're trying to figure out which one is the best. But just know that if you're looking at this, if I were to go in and change this region, it probably would change the pricing, at least a little bit. Operating system, you can select your operating system. What type of server is it? You get different tiers that exist in here, and you can set, what your what size are you looking at within here. How many VMs it is, our runtime, what type of license we're going to use, etc. So it lets you go through, add in inputs to be able to build out what you expect that build to be like. There's also some saving options that are added within here. So Azure reservations can get factored into this. What Azure reservations are, it's a 1 to 3 year commitment to Microsoft on a amount of spend that gets allocated to a specific resource. I don't recommend, if you're just getting started, to utilize a reservation in the beginning. Give it a little bit of time as you go through it, and as you get an idea of what the workload looks like, because you may need to adjust it once you get your workload up in there before you really consider that. There are also a handful of caveats associated with that. I won't go into a ton of the details on it, but if you're looking at reservations, definitely go through and look at the details on that before you consider it. But if you have they're usually best, just for reference, if it's a 24/7 and predictable workload. It can give you a tremendous amount of savings on it. So if you're in the cloud today and you've already got things running, reservations may be a good opportunity to look at cost savings with what you already have within there. Azure Hybrid Benefit, I alluded to that one a little bit earlier. You can factor that in. If you have Windows and SQL Server licenses on-prem today that you have software assurance on, you can transfer those licenses to the cloud. So if I'm migrating a VM, for instance, that's running SQL Server on-prem, I can take those licenses with me and I don't have to repay for those once I get into the cloud, which can introduce a big cost savings on it. And then so forth. I can go through it and can set up my disk. Like number of transactions is one that you may look at and feel like you're a little bit nickeled and dimed. I put in there just the default, which is 100, which is 5 cents. Some of these, the numbers are going to be so low that it's not really worth the time necessarily to go through and try to figure out exactly what that's going to look like. If it was a highly transactional system, I mean, you're probably still looking at a fairly low number. And this comes back to like some of those unique little small measures there. Those sorts of things are where, I go back to starting low and slow. So, moving something within there of maybe just one application, tracking your costs over a period of time using Azure Cost Management within the portal, and monitoring that to see, okay, where's my cost getting consumed within this particular service? And there's ways you can break that cost down to figure out exactly what component of that service is eating my cost. But that'll answer a lot of those questions for you. But in the big ones, in terms of VMs, it's largely going to be based on your storage and then what tier of service that you're using within there. Other ones, again, you have app services. So if you want to specify use for an app service, Azure SQL Database, you can go through. Again, I have some of these configured where I can select my different types. I can select my different instances, and I can build out, again, what it looks like that I'm going to be migrating. Once I get built out on what I am expecting of whatever I'm going to migrate, of what it looks like, it's going to give me a total cost on it, which becomes, okay, this is based on a monthly cost of what I expect that monthly cost to be like on a monthly basis. I can take this, I can save it. Highly recommend hitting save if you're building something out, just because it does not auto save it for you. Or I can export it. Looks like I hit the export button a moment ago already. So, and when I open this up, it breaks down the cost for me in an Excel format. So what this then becomes the basis of, if you're building a budget, this becomes the framework for what you're adding to your budget to give you an idea of your run rate on here. You may shoot a little bit, if you build this out and you're trying to budget for the next year and you're thinking you're going to move applications within there, you might want to add a little bit of fluff to some of this. I usually, what I have done in the past is usually I'll tag on, if it's not a humongous workload, about 20% from a budgetary standpoint of what I build out here, unless I'm really comfortable with the services that I'm moving, that I can really estimate those really well. So, but this gives me the basis for what will become my budget of my Azure spend. Throughout the process, on any project that I've worked on, build out your estimate within Azure, but know it's a tool that you use throughout the process. So it's not just I come in here in the beginning and I can go through and add all these different services within there. It's something that as I learn more, as I implement things, I can come in and continue to tweak and be able to track what my budgeted cost is as I'm actually doing the deployments and learning new things about it. I can come in here to adjust. So that is a high-level look at the calculator. I know there's probably a tremendous amount more we could go through within these. But again, just know that the services that you're using should exist within this calculator. You can add them to an estimate and work through filling out your values within there. So let's hop back over to the deck. All right, so some important considerations for this calculator, just some things to keep in mind. Try not to underestimate as much as you can. I know it's easy just to go in there and just guess on some of these values, but I would encourage you to really think about it. Go and look at some data. If you're monitoring some of these applications or some of these servers, look at your metrics on those to see, how are they running? Are they utilizing all these resources? Really consider that when you're thinking about building it. One important kind of difference in thought that we have if you've worked in an on-prem environment versus the cloud is we want things to run a little bit hotter when we go to the cloud versus what we do on-prem. So I come from a DBA background, which managed SQL servers for many, many years. And traditionally, we liked for our servers to kind of be around that 30% CPU utilization mark. Maybe run a little higher, maybe run a little lower, but that was kind of the sweet spot usually. And anything running over that, we were either digging into it or potentially adding additional memory, etc. Within the cloud, kind of had to change my thinking on that a little bit because you're paying for what you're consuming. Unlike in an on-prem environment where you're sharing resources across your environment, if you have more allocated, that's okay because it's not necessarily getting consumed like on a VM level at the host level. But within the cloud, because you're paying for everything that you're consuming, you want things to run a little bit higher. So, where traditionally maybe 30% on-prem was kind of the sweet spot, 80% of CPU utilization within the cloud is probably going to be the sweet spot because I don't want to be paying for more CPU than what I'm actually consuming. So try to look at that. Try not to underestimate. Just know that something small can add up to a lot on it. Again, back up what you're entering with data. Try to go through, look at the services that you're considering running, and really factor that into how you're building out those estimates. Another important consideration is the calculator does not tell you which products have dependencies on others. So if you're building a VM, there's going to be some networking dependencies that are based on that. I don't have a list to give you of all of those. Just know that as you're building things out, there may be other dependencies. Again, that's why I say when you're budgeting these out, add on a little bit of fluff because there could be additional components that you may not have considered. Also, some of those dependencies you may figure out again by starting low and slow. Hit the save button when you're making changes. Just know that if you build any estimates within there for your migration, it is not going to auto-save those. So if you do not hit that save button and you close it out, you'll lose everything that you put into there. Use it throughout the analysis process. We talked about that. It's not just a one-hit thing that you do in the beginning, something you do throughout your migration. And even as you get into Azure or get into a cloud services, it's something that you even want to continue using once you have items within there. The data is exportable, as I showed you there. And then another important factor is Egress is not factored into that calculator as well. We'll talk about Egress here in a few moments. If you're kind of thinking of just kind of simple ways to be able to look through the calculator, of ways to be able to use it to the max, here's a simple way to look at it. Calculate, evaluate, infiltrate. So you may have heard these referred to in other manners of things that you may have worked on. So it's a great way to be able to look at it of how you're going to utilize the calculator. With Calculate, create estimates and experiment with it. Go in there. There's different ways you can architect solutions. There's not just always a one-size-fits-all type approach. There's a lot of different ways you can do it. For example, if I'm moving a SQL workload, I could use an Azure VM, a managed instance, an Azure SQL DB, serverless database. There's a lot of different things that I can do. And when I think about my architecture and as I'm constructing my architecture, I may go through and I may build that estimate out a few different ways. I may build various estimates to be able to calculate the cost with different ways of building it and find which one works best for me. Evaluate, ask yourself questions throughout that process as you're looking through that. Ask yourself, is there a better way to be able to do this? Is this cost high? Is my business not going to allow me to do this based on this? Is there something else that I can do? And then the last one, I talked about again, getting in there, using the product, getting familiar with it, infiltrate it, understand the product the best you can. If you're looking at an architecture and it's one that you're not familiar with, utilize those free credits to get into there and just be able to build things and start playing with it to see if it's something that may work for you. Big scary egress. So in conversations with my business leadership, both within this company and with other companies that I've worked with, egress seems to be one that gives them the biggest fear. And what I mean by egress is it's data leaving Azure. So it doesn't cost you anything to migrate anything into Azure, but it does cost you money to be able to pull data out of Azure. And it gives a lot of companies a lot of scare because it's a really, really hard one to be able to estimate on it. But it's really not quite as scary as what you may think. You probably know on any of the workloads that you're thinking about moving, what is utilizing that? What is data coming out? If you're going to move a application to the cloud, it's probably best to move the data or vice versa. So when you're thinking about moving things, you may not want to split up dependencies. Like I may not want an application to remain on-prem and continue to query data and pull that data out via an application because it's going to come as a cost. So you may think about bundling some of the items that you're going to move to the cloud together. So looking at those dependencies of how data is flowing out to other applications is a consideration you're going to want to think about as you're thinking through your migration. You probably don't want to move a service into Azure that's replicating back down to on-prem. So if you're using a transactional replication or some other replication technology, you may not want to move that necessarily to the cloud because it is going to eat up some cost. And then as I mentioned, while you do pay a premium, just know it's not necessarily maybe as bad as you may think. It's about 22 cents a gig is the current rate on Egress. And if it's going to take, you're going to have to output a lot of data, and you're probably going to be familiar with why it's doing that before you do the migration for that to really turn into a material cost. So again, not necessarily as bad as what you may think, but it is important to evaluate your dependencies when you're thinking about moving something to the cloud. All right, determine your architecture. So these, at the time that I built this slide, these are all the different components and different services that you can run in Azure today. And as you can see, there are a lot. And I'm sure this list has even grown since I grabbed this screenshot. But there are a lot of different services that you can look at. In determining your architecture early on and figure out which services you want to look at, cost is going to be a factor in there. And it may be a big factor for you and your organization to get in there and to be able to look at these different ones. So one may be cheaper than the other, but it may offer additional benefits. But just thinking about your architecture in terms of cost is going to be really, really important. When you get into SQL database and you're thinking about moving your SQL workloads to the cloud, you'll notice that on Azure SQL DB, there's a couple of different options. And you'll notice this on some other services as well, where they'll have a couple of different options of how you can do those. But specific to Azure SQL DB, you'll notice that there's a DTU and there's a VCore option in terms of building those out. I put together this chart that kind of gives you a comparison between what those are, but the big difference between those is the DTU is an all-encompassing price versus a VCore, which is traditional VCore of how you would think about it in an on-prem scenario on a virtual machine. When you're looking at these and you're trying to figure out maybe which one I want to use, use the factors. Again, just because we're from a timing standpoint, I won't read through those and talk about each one of those. But you're probably going to want to do some comparison between them. But as a general consensus, if you're thinking about moving something to Azure SQL DB, DTUs are generally going to be better for really small workloads versus VCores are probably going to be a little more manageable in terms of maybe some of your bigger workloads. So if you just need something that's really small and it's under 100 DTU and you can run it within there, which is a blended measure, probably going to work out a little better for you in terms of cost. There is a calculator for the there is a DTU calculator for Azure SQL DB. So if you're trying to evaluate your workloads and you're trying to figure out how that would translate to the cloud, you can utilize this DTU calculator. And what it is there's a you download a PowerShell script if you were to go to that website on there, and you can run it on your system to capture workload during a peak time, and then it outputs a file that you can then import into the calculator, and it'll tell you, give you an estimate on here's what tier that we would expect that you would need to run at within Azure. You can also use this particular calculator to even translate it to a VCore. It doesn't specifically tell you VCore, but a DTU, just in translation, about every roughly 100 DTU equals 1 VCore. So if it's come back and it's telling you need 800 DTU, that's going to probably transfer over to about an 8 VCore. One other thing that I will call out on this is if you are using SentryOne, I did write a process that allows you to be able to use existing performance data. So if you're using SentryOne today as a tool and you're already collecting data on a SQL workload that you may have, you can utilize data that already exists within your monitoring tool to be able to calculate this. So if you're interested in that, I do have the blog post on there that you could go and check out to be able to utilize that. Next thing is when you're thinking about, again, building your estimates and budgeting for your workloads, you may be budgeting for a period of time. So you're not just budgeting for what you may be using next month. If you're budgeting like what we do on a fiscal year or through a calendar year, you're really going to want to consider what this is going to look like by the end of the year. Same way you would do it if you were looking at an on-prem solution. And factor that into your cost. So don't just look at it from the standpoint of, well, here's what I need in January of Q1 if my budget is from January to December. Think about what you're going to need to be able to run that particular solution between December up, and build that into your calculations as you're building that into the calculator. All right, some other impacts, some considerations that impact cost. So again, I talked a little bit about, one of the most difficult things is just getting that foundation set up. And networking is a huge component of that. How am I going to access Azure? How am I going to do it securely? What kind of bandwidth do I need? What do I need to be able to get connected in? Those are all things that you're going to want to consider when you're thinking about your migration. And maybe that doesn't necessarily fall on you. Maybe that falls on a member of another team that you need to connect up with. But these are all things that you're going to want to think about when you're really trying to think about costs, especially if you're just considering whether to move. So those considerations would be latency, data transfers, bandwidth, runtime, external connections, et cetera there. I haven't noticed through migrations that I have done, those really incorporating a large amount of cost. But if you know you're going to be inputting a ton of data in and a ton of data out, you may want to do some due diligence there to really kind of see what that is. Again, starting low and slow, you're going to get a better idea of what those networking costs are going to do for you. You may consider, depending on how much you're moving, to put in an express route. An express route is a dedicated connection that is dropped between you and the Azure data center, which gives you a direct line into there. And it's a dedicated connection. It's not going to saturate your network within your organization. So it's dedicated to it. Translating on-prem to the cloud. So a difficult thing to be able to do for a lot of folks is when they're thinking about doing their migration is understanding, okay, how does my existing workload translate into a cloud workload? So all hardware, as you guys probably know, is not created equal. And the hardware that you may be using on-prem may be very different than the hardware you're thinking of using within the cloud. I recommend doing some baseline testing between those to understand, again, how is it going to perform when you move into the cloud. So moving an application, running some tests to get an idea of performance impacts, etc., is going to be beneficial there. And then, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, only use what you need in the cloud. So your systems should be consuming most of the resources that are allocated to them within there. All right, so on to baselining performance, I'll tell you a little trick that I will use for SQL Server just to kind of get an idea of it. There's probably a lot of different ways that you can evaluate it. You can move things within Azure. Again, if you're starting low and slow and you want to move something within your Azure environment, you can put it in there, run some tests on it, get an idea of how it works. Within your data workloads, something that I will commonly do is I'll use just static general tables. So we'll create a table and I'll throw just a handful of million rows in it, and I'll run queries on it from an on-prem, and I'll capture the statistics on it. So I'll use statistics IO on, set statistics time on to be able to get the time on it, and I'll create a bunch of dummy queries that just generate some compute on them, and I'll capture the time run on it. And then when I run those queries on the same system within production, I'll create that same exact table that exists on there, and I'll run those same queries and check the time performance on it to try to compare, okay, what does my on-prem look like versus what does it look like within the cloud? A lot of different other options that you can do on there, but trying to baseline your performance, get an idea of the performance between what it looks like on-prem to the cloud is going to help you a lot in terms of your cost estimations, because just know that all of that hardware is not necessarily created equal. So some tips to lower costs. So we're coming up here, wrapping up. So I'll run through these fairly quickly. So if you are thinking of moving to the cloud, here's some quick tips on ways you can help lower those costs. First one, utilize reserve pricing. As I mentioned on that one, you may want to give it a little bit of time to get an understanding of your workload. There are a lot of stipulations associated with that. But if you do have predictable 24/7 workloads and they're consistent, it's a great way to be able to save money based on by making a commitment to Microsoft on that spend. Azure Hybrid Benefit, which allows you to be able to transfer your licenses from on-prem to the cloud. Additionally, it can be a huge benefit. Just know that if you do that, it does require software assurance on those licenses to be able to do that. Managing runtime hours. So you'll notice when we were looking at the calculator, there was an option in there that allows you to be able to specify runtime hours. There are several services that exist that you don't have to run 24/7. I can run those only during times that I actually need to be running those. So if I have a VM that's running a service or an app, but it's only being used during business hours, I can shut that down when it's not being used to avoid having to pay that additional cost for it to run throughout the night. So I can manage when things run. Within SQL Server, like Azure SQL DB and Managed Instance, those you don't have the ability to be able to pause those and stop cost. But what you do have the ability with those is to be able to tier them down to a lower tier at times that they're not really crucial or need to be running. So you do have an option to scale down as well and manage those. Next one is think and rethink architecture. Think about your architecture and what you're doing. So we talked about that quite a lot. Remove and turn off things you don't need. So once you get things in your building and within Azure, it's good to go through and do routine audits to make sure that what you're running are things that you still need, so that, make sure there's not anything out there that was a dev server that you may have spun up to do something really quickly and you left it running or forgot to go through and delete it, etc. there's a lot of waste that is consumed by just people leaving things running when they don't need them or not removing them when they're done with them. Monitor resource utilization. So resource utilization may change over time. So if you're building things in there, initially you may need a higher tier service, but maybe you do some tuning on those and you lower the resource utilization. If that's the case, look for those to be able to go through and be able to scale those down, which is going to save you money. But you're going to want to have something that you're doing monitoring on that over periods of time. Utilize dev test pricing. I didn't mention this. This is one I did not mention before. But within your subscriptions, you can utilize, if you're a Visual Studio subscriber, you can utilize a special pricing for your dev test environments. This is applied on the subscription layer. So when you build your subscription, you would specify whether or not it's dev test. But this can save you a lot of money as well if you're building VMs or if you're in there and you're doing development and testing, to build those within a subscription that utilizes that dev test pricing. And use Azure Cost Management. So when you go within the portal, you can navigate to Azure Cost Management. This gives you a Power BI-esque dashboard that you can go through and be able to navigate your cost to look at your spend. And there's a ton of different resource and financial dimensions that exist within there that allow you to really navigate and dive through your cost to figure out where your spend is. Again, we mentioned Azure Hybrid Benefit. If you're interested, they do have a specific calculator for that as well that you can go in there and be able to factor that. But the important thing is to just know that you can take your licenses with you to the cloud. Non-Azure factors, and as we wrap up here with just a few moments left here. So some of the non-Azure factors would be that don't get necessarily calculated into the calculator, would be things such as monitoring tools. Or additional software that you may need from an IaaS component. Maybe your security team requires that you have certain components installed on those servers, such as antivirus software, for instance, on those. Just know that any additional cost related to anything that needs to be added to those is not going to be factored into your estimates. Another important factor is making sure your applications are supported in the cloud and if your application license is transferable. So if you're using a off-the-shelf application that you're thinking about moving to the cloud, work with your vendor of whoever that application is to make sure that it's supported in the cloud and that the application licenses that you may need for that are transferable with it. And then the other one that I'll call out here is training for your staff. So again, if you're making the commitment to look to move to Azure, and get there, you're going to need your staff to be able to support that. So adding in dollars for training to be able to get them up to speed is going to be really critical to success. All right, the last slide here, selling to your business and building an ROI. So if you're, we talked some earlier about some of the benefits of the cloud, and all of those are selling points that you can use to sell to your business for the migration. But how else can I do this? Like, how do I begin to build that return on investment for my business and go through and present to them items on this? Well, the first point is a lot of what we've talked about here today is comparing your on-prem cost to estimated cloud cost. Building out those costs within the Azure Calculator and, being able to communicate that to your business. You can use the TCO calculator as well to be able to do a more in-depth comparison on there, but being able to speak to how those on-prem costs look versus the estimated cloud cost. The shift from CapEx to OpEx. So maybe your organization, likes to assume operating costs versus capital costs, where a capital cost is going to be hardware, a big upfront commitment. Maybe they prefer to go to an OpEx approach where they're paying on a monthly basis. So that can help build it. Utilization. So within the cloud, one of the big advantages of the cloud is only paying for what you consume. So being able to limit that consumption by, maxing out your resources can be a huge selling point for organizations. The time to deploy. Big selling point is I can deploy things within Azure and I can spin up without having to wait for months for hardware to come in. I can literally spin something up in a matter of minutes as opposed to months from an on-prem. The ability to quickly scale. Again, I can go in there and with the click of a few buttons, I can scale something up. If I bring on, if I'm an organization, I'll bring on a lot of new customers and I get a big deal, I can very quickly scale that up to meet those demands within Azure, as opposed to, again, on an on-prem solution, having to go through, and do that spin. And then just the overall, what I call quality of, cloud solutions. So things like availability, reliability, recoverability, responsiveness, etc. These are all things that you can be able to utilize to build out your ROI for your organization. All right. And that wraps up the presentation. Looks like we're just about right on time, but does anyone have any questions? If you do have any questions, you can drop them in the chat window over there, and happy to answer those. All right. I don't see anything in there. If you do have questions after this presentation, feel free to drop me a line. I'll put back up my contact information on here. If you do have questions or you're thinking about it, you're looking at it from your organization's perspective and you want to reach out, feel free to do that. Hit me up on Twitter, shoot me an email, and I'm happy to assist you with it or help point you in the right direction. It's a big topic to tackle in about an hour's time frame, but so there's a lot of additional resources I can share with you on it. All right, with that, I'll go ahead and wrap this up. Appreciate your guys' time and listening to me, and very thankful to be a part of this. And hope you guys enjoy the rest of Code PaLOusa. Thank you very much.